Welcome to the Ad Nauseam podcast, where classical gourmands everywhere can finally get their fill. Join us for a delectable discussion of Greco-Roman civilization stretching from the Minoans and Mycenaeans through the Renaissance and right down to the present. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here are your hosts, Dr. David Noe and Dr. Jeff Winkle.
Welcome, Ad Nauseam listeners, to episode 178 of our little podcast. As always, my name is Dr. David C. Noe. The C stands for... What do you think, Jeff?
Charitable.
Charitable.
Yeah.
That's really kind of you. I would never say that about you, ironically. I'm down here in the vomitorium. This is Bunker Central, Vomitorium Central, the omphalos, the belly button of the world, we like to think, with my good friend and completely desmarched co-host, Dr. Jeffrey T. Winkle. What does the T stand for?
Let's see. The last episode it was tenacious.
Tenacious J.
I want to say trivial.
Trivial.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Kind of Hecatian, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Get the
right.
reference?
Oh,
the
yes,
trivia?
exactly.
All
trivia,
right.
Yep.
What are we doing today, Jeff?
We have a special guest. I'm really excited about this. We are talking to Bram Tenberg,
Right.
who is a Tacitian scholar at Hope College, and he has fairly recently published this wonderful book.
Yes, 2023.
On kind of finding a common thread through all of the surviving works of Tacitus.
That's
and,
right.
It's really cool.
Writing Imperial History. And Bram teaches at an institution that is the great rival of the place where we used to teach.
Yes.
And yet I'm looking forward to an excellent and collegial conversation with this fine scholar.
Exactly. None of that old rivalry.
Oh, no.
That's all
No.
water under the bridge.
And
yes.
Bram is quite an accomplished athlete.
Yeah. Tennis player.
Yes.
Right?
And
Came here from the Netherlands
Yes.
On a tennis scholarship.
So it'll be interesting to hear some of those things and see what he says about that.
Yeah.
But we have a shout out today.
We do.
Yes.
This is one from one Daniel Burdine.
Yes,
right?
Burdine, I don't know. Let's call the whole thing off.
Yeah.
Burdine. Jeff, you want to get us started on this?
Sure. He wrote to us and said, I've been a long-time listener, but have rarely commented or emailed you all for your fine work. While I did not listen to your pilot episode.
Oh, wait a minute.
Uh-oh.
He didn't listen to the pilot episode?
Usually people start at the beginning, so he's just
I
diving
would
in.
think
All right.
so.
Well, that's all right. That's all right.
He started at the flight attendant episode?
He says, I do recall starting with your series on Homer's Iliad at episode 2 during a road trip back to scenic Northeast Ohio.
Huh.
Almost immediately, I passed on the series to a friend who, from all appearances, enjoys it as much as I do. I've recently been enjoying your episodes on Carl Richards and Maru as they come out. I'm a recent seminary graduate learner, Greek and Hebrew primarily to translate and exegete for a sermon or paper. You want to pick it up there?
Sure. He says, however, partly because of your Latin per diem episodes and partly because of one of my own professors, I have come to enjoy Greek on its own terms.
Fantastic.
That's very good news, Daniel. And perhaps will one day attempt Latin, if only, he says, there were a good online alternative for learning it.
Someday, Daniel, it'll happen.
Again, he says, I greatly enjoy the podcast. Now, Jeff, it gets really good.
Yes.
He says, I enjoy the podcast, the banter,
Fantastic.
and the cheesy opening joke.
Wow, somebody actually likes it.
Yes.
That's great. Okay.
Thank you for the work that you and Dr. Winkle do at filling us with the classics.
Fantastic. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Daniel,
Really
for listening.
appreciate that.
Keeping the flame lit out there, sharing the podcast with friends. And he also by this shout out, entered his name in the drawing for the ratio 4.
That's an automatic?
Well, he asked, and
Okay.
he spelled the word right. So see, he already knows one Latin word, quatuor. He's on his way.
Fantastic.
So we'll talk about this more in the episode. But Jeff, without further ado,
yes,
to use the Dutch term, let's welcome Bram to the program. So, Bram, welcome to the show.
Thank you guys for having me.
Of course. Jeff, as we get into it with our special guest today, where do we want to start?
I always like to start with our guest. Bram is a classicist.
Right.
And so I'm always curious to hear kind of what drew you to the field and how far back in your life has this love of the classics gone? And just tell us a little bit about your journey to
Right. We want to get your your autobiography a little bit before you start talking about the deep Tacitian features, which will fascinate our audience.
Yeah. No, my journey goes quite far back to when I was about 9 or 10. So I grew up in the Netherlands, and I'm actually somewhat bizarrely a third-generation classicist.
Interesting.
But through no sort of explicit guidance or influence. So my grandfather, whom I never met, he died when my dad was 16. He actually got his PhD in classics in Groningen right after the war, during and after the war, with a dissertation on antiphon. And then his son, my dad's brother, did an MA in classics and ended up teaching Latin at a high school in the Netherlands. Met his wife, my aunt, who was also a classicist. And then I'm like, yeah, this is really bizarre. But like we never like sort of like talked about this. Like, this is totally what you should do. Right. So my first sort of real exposure was in high school during one of these open days where I took like one of these like class visits where they taught a Latin class in the Netherlands in the Gymnasium system, and I was completely hooked. And then, you do Latin and Greek sort of was mandatory in the Netherlands, not really any choice involved. So I took, 5 years of Latin, 5 years of Greek, a lot of classical civilization classes. And that's really where it started. And then I moved to America on a tennis scholarship. I always have to mention that. I moved to Mississippi, to the University of Mississippi, which otherwise makes no sense to people.
That's in Oxford, right? Oxford, Mississippi.
Yeah, Oxford, Mississippi. That's right. Yeah. So I moved there, and then, in my sophomore year, my professors were like, you kind of have to choose a major now. It's kind of time. And I was like, okay, well, what do I actually love doing? Right. Classics. And then from there, I ended up at the University of Michigan, and then the rest is sort of history.
Wow. Yeah. So now I have to say, you don't look especially Dutch. Where's the blonde hair and the? Are you what they call South Dutch?
South, yeah. My dad is from the very deep South, so that would explain that. And they tend to have darker. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, some Spanish influence.
Yes, exactly.
And this is a really fascinating story about Groningen and all those places. I have to clear my throat there. Kim Clijsters, isn't she a famous Dutch tennis player?
She's Belgian.
Oh, she's Belgian. So who's the most famous Dutch tennis player?
I think the name that would resonate with most people is probably Richard Krajicek, who won Wimbledon in '96. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So have you met him is the question.
I met him. I practiced with him once.
Okay.
So
Did you go easy on him?
Well, he went easy on me, and I pointed out some things I did not yet possess, which I never came to possess either. So in hindsight, he was quite right about some of my shortcomings. But yeah, I practiced with him one time. Super nice guy, and yeah.
So impressive. Now, in the Netherlands, do you play tennis with wooden shoes on, or do you wear the standard?
No, quite standard. Yeah, okay. The wooden shoes are quite sort of restricted to the farming community.
Jeff, I'm going to hand it off to you after insulting our guest like that.
Yeah, no, I'm curious if you could go back. So your upper, you took 5 years of Latin and 5 years of Greek.
Yes, yeah.
And being a young man, that's not that long ago. Is it two questions or a question and a statement? Is is it still like that in the Netherlands?
Oh yeah,
Wow, that's amazing. When you started to kind of pursue classics here in the States, I'm sure you noticed that those expectations have long died on the vine. I'm curious of kind of your reaction to somebody coming from a system where that was still part and parcel of a.
Mostly sad, right? Yeah. Sad that a lot of kids don't get exposure to it, and even in high schools where Latin is alive and well, often the Greek side of things isn't.
Right.
And that is, I find that personally, obviously, as classicists, we all understand that as a tragic thing.
Right.
And most students will never be exposed to it. So we get lucky when we catch the students sort of like choosing Latin or Greek as their language requirement at Hope College, and then hopefully we interest them enough that they'll stick around. But yeah, for me, people sometimes say like, oh, these languages, right? Because we also had instruction in French and in German for like the same amount of years. And that makes sense.
Obviously.
English, 6 years, right? Because if you drive an hour and a half south from where my family lives, you're either in Belgium or in Germany. And, most places don't speak Dutch. So this was normal for me. And even though it makes sense, for America, you can be in a car for 20 hours, you get out of the car and someone will speak English to you. There's not that same sort of like need, but, just in terms of sheer sort of like, pedagogical sort of like, virtue, learning languages is such an important thing that often doesn't really get recognized any longer. And I find that personally very, very sad, very tragic.
No quarrel from us, of course. So you went to Oxford, Mississippi on a tennis scholarship, you said? And then you were studying classics there, and I've never been to that campus, but I understand it's a beautiful campus with magnolias and Spanish moss, and just a beautiful place.
Yeah, it is.
And then from there on to the University of Michigan. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Was the plan Were you thinking about going pro? Was that the original plan to play
He
tennis?
is a professional classicist.
I'm talking about tennis.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, initially, like, so the way that this typically goes, like my entire teenage years, I walked that path, playing all these
Right.
international events, and it happened to be like, I'm from the same birth year as Nadal and like Murray, Djokovic are all in there. So I played the same tournaments. I, of course, lost early. They won everything. That's kind of the difference. But then I wasn't really planning on going pro, anymore in college. But then in the final semester, I'd been doing particularly well in doubles with my doubles partner. And then the question kind of arose, like, okay, do you want to do this? But then I had a pretty terrible shoulder injury in my final season.
No.
And then I got into Michigan kind of last minute. I kind of like sort of snuck in at the very end. And then it was kind of like, I cannot give that up. That's just absurd. And so then I kind of like left it behind, moved into graduate school and just put all my sort of like focus on that. So that's kind of the backstory there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then you were you were in Ann Arbor from roughly 2012 to 2017. Is that about right?
I started there in 2009 and ended up, well, I guess graduating sounds weird for graduate school, but I defended it at the very end of 2015 and then quote unquote graduated in early 16, April of 16. Yeah. And then did a postdoc at Kalamazoo College, and then ended up at Hope after that. So I have this, like, people think I have this weird attachment to Michigan, but you both know how the job market works.
Yeah,
it's just like luck of the draw.
As a Dutchman winding up in Holland, Michigan,
it's weird.
Some irony there.
Well, it's weird because there's like a lot of people who'll hear my story and they're like, "Oh, you're from the Netherlands, so and you chose to live in Holland, Michigan. That's so nice." And I'm like, "You don't understand our field. Like, I had nothing to do with this." And so, yeah.
So the tulips and the heated streets were not the big draw, right?
Not the tulips. I have to say the heated streets are pretty cool. We don't have that in the Netherlands, but the tulips aren't really going to make me super excited anymore now.
So for our listeners, the city of Holland, Michigan, and one of you gentlemen can probably be more specific than I am. There are some streets in the downtown. I think they're cobblestone, they're brick covered.
8th Street.
Okay, and beneath it, one of the local philanthropists has installed heated pipes, right? That pipe hot water underneath, and so the snow melts off the streets.
Yep.
It's like the opposite of a winter wonderland at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty cool and desperately necessary here with the snow. Yeah, it even snowed this morning.
Yeah.
And so along the way, you married and had a daughter to whom the book is dedicated, the one we're talking about today. So what a blessing that must be for you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So my wife Maggie and I met in Rome. This is like one of these like classic stories, right? So Maggie is a Roman archaeologist.
Oh, wow.
At the time at Tufts University, and they ended up, co-organizing this archaeological program for 6 weeks in Rome. I saw a poster on one of my professor's doors in Ann Arbor, and I was like, that looks nice. I got nothing better to do. Let's just go, and like the rest is history. And so there
you met Maggie. And,
Wow. 2011.
Yeah,
it's kind of cool, and especially for people that are not in our field, they're like, oh, that's amazing. And for us, it's kind of like, this is kind of how these things tend to go sometimes. And and she's at Grand Valley State now, and so like we're good, we're happy. Yeah,
that's great.
I'm just happy you didn't meet on an app. So
that's right. Oh gosh, yes, please, yes.
Happening a lot these days. When he found out that she was an expert in archaeology, he said, "I could really dig this girl."
Okay, yeah.
Well, we should get around to talking some Tacitus.
So the next question, right, is when did you conceive this interest in Tacitus? Was it early? Was it late? And how did it develop into this wonderful book that we're discussing today?
So, the way that some of these like big classics programs, PhD programs work is where after you've done, sort of like your initial like coursework, your qualifier exams and all that kind of stuff. At Michigan, you do 3 semesters on sort of like a specialty author in Latin, specialty author in Greek, and then a special field. And for Latin, I chose to do this with David Potter, who ended up being my later doctoral advisor. And we did this on Tacitus, and I was just hooked from the start. Like from the first day, I was like, this is amazing. And that's basically where it started. So I think that takes us back to about 2011 or so.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So you didn't read any Tacitus as an undergrad, or maybe
Nope.
just snippets or anything like that?
No, a little bit here and there in sort of like these larger lit survey classes,
Right.
at which point I was also very interested, but that never became bigger at the time because that's very circumscribed. And so
Right.
when it really became sort of in depth was during that semester with David, and that kind of changed everything.
Okay.
So could you, for our listeners, talk a little bit about, before we got to get into your particular scholarship, is how would you describe the importance of Tacitus in Roman history, the place of historiography fit in with like a Thucydides or a Sallust, and where is he in kind of the big picture?
Yeah, so if you want to do like sort of like a short 30-second summary of ancient historiography, the big names obviously it sort of starts with Herodotus and Thucydides. We throw Xenophon in there shortly thereafter. We throw Polybius, of course, in there. And on the Latin side of things, you then quickly start talking Sallust, Livy, and then really you get to Tacitus next because of all the losses we have in between. And Tacitus is important because he is widely acknowledged to be the best source we have on early imperial history, despite the major gaps in his works. Now, the other sources that we have on that period, right? You start to then talk about Suetonius, which is, biography, of course, historical in some respects, but not pure history. And then you get to authors like, Cassius Dio, who of course is much later. And so for that particular period, he is our closest witness, our most comprehensive witness. And then, we can talk about this later, like the way that he, sifted through different source materials and the way that he chronicles those periods, also probably the most detail oriented, or provides the best details I think we have, at least literarily, like on those reigns. So yeah, he's incredibly important, not only in terms of the coverage, but I think also in terms of his understanding of what historiography does. He has very Sallustian sort of features to his writing. He's obviously highly indebted to Livy as well, but writes in a distinctively sort of different way, has a different understanding of what history does. And for that reason, obviously, is an important sort of step in the longer sort of history of historical writing, sort of writ large. And so, yeah, he's super important, very important. Yeah.
So thank you for that. And Bram, can you give us, I have a follow-up question here, but again, I think Tacitus is one of those authors that is probably less familiar even to the serious students of Roman history. A lot of what they're reading is probably Tacitian in terms of its origin, because you said he's the best source for the early imperial era, but they may not know that they're actually reading insights that were culled from Tacitus. So could you give us a brief sketch of his opera? What are his main works, the minor works, and then we'll get into some of the specifics of your thesis in this book.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tacitus broadly, right, lived from 55-ish to 120-ish. There are 5 names for 5 works, I should say, to his name that have survived to us. First 3 shorter works, and then the 2 longer historical works. So the first work in 98 AD is a biography, technically, of his father-in-law. Now, his father-in-law, a guy named Agricola, was the governor of Britain for 7 years, a very successful governor, successful senator. So he writes that first. It's 46 chapters, very short, very rich work.
Right.
And virtually at the same time, he composed an ethnography of the tribes living in the north of Europe, north of the rivers Rhine and Danube. His work is called the Germania. That's the short form, Germania. Very, very influential work, ultimately, in the history of ideas in Europe, which almost no one talks about.
Right.
And then the third work, this is the traditional order, the so-called Dialogus, De Oratoribus, which is a dialogue about the development of the art of oratory under the influence, really, of the emperors. So how has the art of oratory really been influenced by the fact that we now have an emperor, right, around? And then he goes from there to these 2 longer historical works, which are, also interesting in the way that came about. So he starts in the histories, probably in 12 books. We're not 100% sure, probably in 12 books. And that covered the Flavian period. So there, for readers, we're talking about the direct aftermath of the assassination of the Emperor Nero. So then we're in 68 AD. Okay. Yeah, all the way until the assassination of the Emperor Domitian, the last of the Flavian emperors, in 96. And then, interestingly, he goes back further in time in his final work, in the Annals, probably originally in 18 books, where he starts, interestingly, with the death of the Emperor Augustus. He doesn't chronicle Augustus's age or reign, but he starts with his death and the funeral, and then he goes all the way to the death of Nero, so roughly 14 AD to 68 AD.
Yep. That's a very helpful survey. Thank you. That's fascinating. So in the Domitian period, the eruption of Vesuvius, right?
That's
Flavian, I should say.
Yep.
And then the construction of the Colosseum, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, to the casual student of Tacitus, those seem like really monumental events that took place. Does Tacitus give them the same amount of airtime as we might like? How does he treat those two incidents?
He did, but we don't have those works. So he would have. Yeah, this is the annoying part, and I'm actually in the final stages of a co-edited book with a friend from England, where we actually try to reconstruct those lost portions of Tacitus' oeuvre, which should come out probably sometime next year, hopefully. But where we try to come to terms with what we've lost, and can we, in any reasonable way, reconstruct what would have been there, and what would that then subsequently mean for our understanding of Tacitus. But yeah, these events took place under Vespasian and Titus in the lost portions of the history. So we don't know how that was covered, but we do know from, this is cool stuff. He actually, on the eruption of Vesuvius, which Pliny the Younger, who seems to have been a close friend of Tacitus's, witnessed that event personally, and obviously therefore was a great source of information. And we have personal letters between the two in which they exchanged information on those events, where Tacitus personally asked Pliny, give me, the rundown, what happened, and I will include it in my histories. But we don't have the actual account, which is just so irritating. Yeah.
I wonder if you could also comment a bit on kind of Tacitus's literary persona. I was actually thinking about this the other day in a class of mine. I was talking about the Neronian persecution, and of course I always read the famous passage from Tacitus. And the way that he describes Rome and the way that he describes early Christians. That one of my students raised her hand and says, "Well, this guy hates everybody," right?
Yeah. He definitely has a flavor of Juvenal in him in that respect.
Make misanthropy great again. Kind of
thing. That's right. Exactly right. That's exactly it. And one of the things I find so interesting about him is his capacity to be very critical of imperial Rome, right? Of the Principate as an institution. So that's the emperorship as an institution. And in some ways also of what the Roman Empire does and seeks to accomplish. But to do it in such a way where you kind of maintain plausible deniability, and it allows you to keep rising in that very governmental system that at the same time you're criticizing in your works. So his persona is someone who's very pessimistic, he is cynical, he is direct. There is definitely, despite protestations to the contrary in the opening chapters of the Annals, he's definitely angry, even though he claims he's not. And so, the literary persona is of a very critical observer who wants to kind of rip off the Band-Aid and basically uncover truths that over time have been buried, have been hidden, and to really come to terms with, what are the emperors really like? What is this system really like? And basically what he claims is basically to restore truth. And that is fascinating.
Yeah. So we need to get to the book here in a minute, but just one more kind of preliminary question. Neither Jeff nor I are experts in Tacitus. He's Apuleius, Cicero is my author. One of the things that I did learn in grad school, and I assume this is similar to Jeff, is that Tacitus represents senatorial historiography, that a person who's high up in the Roman leadership along the lines that you were discussing, and yet is writing from a position of deep resentment because he's excluded from power. So my question is, among scholars of Tacitus like yourself, real experts, is that still kind of the controlling interpretation of his career, or has it been revised and changed somewhat?
Yeah, so the interesting thing again about his career is that he is someone who's very successful, and he admits in the opening chapters of the histories that he was advanced, by each of the Flavian emperors. And, in the aftermath of Domitian's assassination, that was an uncomfortable fact to sort of deal with. Because, sort of the background there is when Domitian gets assassinated, the people that kind of sort of stood up against his regime openly, right, and were explicit opponents of his regime, and who in some cases, paid for that with their lives. Those people were extremely popular in the direct aftermath. That makes sense. Whereas people who had been successful under Domitian could be sort of like accused of having been complicit, of having not been outspoken enough. So Tacitus is someone who kind of has to reckon with that legacy, right, in the opening text. And he does that really subtly, like in the Agricola, for instance, where he advocates sort of like this middle path, sort of like in terms of political behavior. So he presents two extremes. On the one hand, you have the people who are completely sort of sycophantic and they flatter the sitting emperor, and they almost, like in some cases, like let themselves become like instruments or tools, right, of an oppressive regime. And on the opposite end of that spectrum, you have these people that are typically called the Stoic martyrs, right? There's these philosopher figures who are like, to hell with the emperors, right? This is all oppression, right? We need to go back to the Republic. And then they end up, being forced to commit suicide. So they're extremely courageous, but, they pay for it with their lives.
Right. Ultimately ineffective.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And Tacitus has this line at the end of the Agricola, which is actually very catchy, is very, very important, where he says, people who want to understand what it's really all about, they should understand that, there can be good people under bad emperors, but they should understand that, it is more useful, to just simply do your work without attracting the wrong kind of attention to yourself. So no showboating, just do your duty, but not attract hostility and envy from the emperor and from other people. So kind of like occupy a middle ground. It's not like you become lazy or indolent and you just kind of like, retreat. You do your duty, but you don't become outspoken. And he advertises that. So he's a senatorial historian, sort of par excellence. He kind of epitomizes that whole idea. He is disgruntled with the system. So what I would say at this stage is that he clearly, sort of like as a basis respects the Republican system of government and its sort of like commitment to freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of action, recognition of people's merits, right, and so forth, and finds the imperial system of government fundamentally oppressive in the sense that, someone who belongs to the senatorial class no longer has the same prerogatives, as someone who was a senator, say, a century and a half before. At the same time, he is very aware of the shortcomings of the Republican system of government because freedom, when basically extended to its logical extension, becomes license, and that carries with it this danger of, internal collapse, discord, ultimately civil war. And so he's someone, I see him, and again, people read him differently because he's so ambiguous in some ways and so rich in his language. But I see him as someone who sees the Principate as a necessary institution that at the same time is systemically flawed in the behavior that it inspires in the emperors and in the restrictions that it imposes on the senatorial class.
It's so interesting. Is there any evidence that animus soften at all? So if he dies 120-ish, he's living in the era of what we sometimes remember as the five good emperors, right? So as Trajan, Hadrian come along, does that soften at all, or does he kind of stick to his?
Yeah, and this is a good question. So first off, people fight about his sort of end date. So there are people who would argue, persuasively in some ways that he died under Trajan, and that has to do with all kinds of complicated things, that we don't want to get into at this point. And then I belong to the school that sees him as having died under Hadrian.
Okay.
One thing that's interesting.
Post 117, is that right?
Yeah, post 117. That's right.
Audience.
Yep, exactly right. And so the problem is, the interesting thing is that in the opening chapters of the histories, he says, look, I'm chronicling this Flavian period, but if I have time, if time permits me, I'm going to produce a history of the current, like the happy times under Nerva. Well, Nerva is dead at this point, but under Trajan. And of course, he never does. He goes further back. Because as everyone knows, and Pliny has a couple of good lines on this, writing current history is virtually impossible if you are beholden to the truth, right? You can't. And so I think that Tacitus is someone who recognizes that Trajan is, for instance, objectively a better person than a Domitian, just as Vespasian was objectively a better person than Nero. But that does not mean that as a society, like, we have now returned to, say, the principles and the ideals of the Republic. So he recognizes there might be a better person, on the, let's call it anachronistically, the throne, whatever. But that does not mean that we're no longer living under the Principate. That still comes with these longer term sort of systemic problems. So, and he has to do it tongue in cheek. And that's one of his great, sort of like virtues where, in a very real way, when he writes the Dialogus and he points out how the emperors, have had this negative influence on the art of oratory, it is clear that those implications are also sort of applicable to his own times. Now, he doesn't say that explicitly, but that is certainly the implication. So the implication is, whatever I said about Tiberius and about Caligula and about Claudius and about Nero equally applies to the current times, which are better in many respects, but are still marked by those systemic restrictions. And so, yes, better, but not what he would ideally like to see.
Right.
That's my take, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
well, that's an excellent setup, Bram. Thank you for getting us set up with the general contours of how to understand Tacitus, his biography, his major works. Now we want to dig down a little deeper here, and I'm looking at page 7 of the text that you sent us, and it's a big, lovely book. And now I want to own it and read the whole thing. I read the introduction, did some skimming in other places. Page 7, there's this quote, and you say, "While interest in the monographs has gained some momentum," and so the monographs would be those 3 that you mentioned, the Agricola, the Germania, and the Dialogus. "And while some scholars have noted continuities across the corpus, a full-length and holistic examination of the relationship and interactions among Tacitus's different works is lacking." So you say, quote, "My aim in this book is to do precisely that, to offer an integrative analysis of the Tacitean corpus." So I admire the clarity of your thesis, right? And if I understand it correctly, you're going to say, I'm going to take these 3 smaller works and compare them to the 2 major works, because the 3 smaller works have been mostly neglected, and I'm going to give you an explanation of the whole thing. Is that the right way to understand what you're doing?
More or less, yeah. So really, if it's interesting, like there have been a couple of scholars, Herbert Benario, who is no longer with us, unfortunately, out of Emory, produced these massive bibliographical sort of like interceptions at various points in Tacitean scholarship. So that would be like a good place where you can see that the lion's share of scholarly attention goes to the Annals. It's always been considered his masterpiece, right? The crowning achievement of his literary career. So most of the, and it covers the early Julio-Claudians, right? This is kind of like the thing that most people veer towards, followed by the history. So he's always sort of gone down in history as a historian, and he's really mostly known for his 2 historical works, which have always been most popular. And then when you add to that, right, so that's more or less like, as scholars, as you well know, right, you inherit these tastes, these assumptions, right, the things that we focus on, the things that we think. And then you add to that sort of like this very thorny issue of genre, right? So if you look at the Agricola is technically a biography. And it concerns, right, the life and career of this senator. Okay.
Isn't it just a way to get in good with his father-in-law? It's got to be the most famous piece of literature ever written about a father-in-law. Jeff, did you write something on your father-in-law?
No, I should have.
You should have.
I think things would be much better now.
That's right.
Yeah, well, we can chat about that. It's a fascinating work. And so, people are like, okay, so we have a biography. And then the Germania, right, which was published more or less at the same time, is this ethnogeography about these tribes in the north of Europe. I'm like, okay, fine. And then you have the Dialogus, right, which is a dialogue, very Ciceronian, right? It's based on these Ciceronian dialogues about an entirely different topic, right? The art of oratory. And then we get 2 historiographical works. So in some ways, people have kept those works kind of like in their respective generic silos and said like, well, look, they don't generically have much overlap. They deal with different subjects. And really, we can't really get to the real Tacitus until we get to the Annals, where he has sort of like fully come into his own. He's fully developed as an author. So that's where most people focus. Then on top of that, if you can still follow at this point,
we're with you.
There is this assumption that there's also this sort of like stark development in his historical thinking. So the assumption is like he is still fairly positive in his outlook in the Agricola. And then he basically becomes pessimistic over time. And by the time we get to the Annals, he's really fully sort of channeling his inner Juvenal, and he's kind of like hating on everything.
So along the way, he had seen a tweet or something from Domitian, and that just drove him over the.
That's it.
Drove him over the edge. That's it.
That's right. There's like this fundamental turning point, and he just became dark, right?
Right.
And so and this is the interesting thing that I did in that thing, the special semester I did with David, where we actually read through the entire corpus, is what you start to see is not only that many of the themes that he explores in those 3 early works simply recur in the last 2 works, but also that he basically doesn't undergo this fundamental shift in his thinking. He's interested in the same things. His outlook on the Principate as a system of government and on the empire basically stay the same. It becomes more intricate for sure. It becomes more detailed, and his explanations get richer, his characterizations get richer, but fundamentally, he basically occupies the same, more or less, position. And so then you start thinking like, it's interesting that people haven't looked at these early 3 works, because they kind of, the status quo had always kind of been, these were early attempts that he sort of used to find his way, sort of like to shape the techniques and the talents necessary to write, history, which even in the ancient world was recognized as one of the more important genres, right? Along with epic, right? Epic and history and these other things, biography, dialogue, that's kind of like playthings almost. And I was like, this doesn't really seem right. You can see that by the time he gets to the Agricola, and he's over 40 at this point, right? He's not a newcomer at this point. You see that his political outlook is there. It's fully shaped, right? It's very well articulated. It's sharp. And a lot of the literary techniques that people typically associate with the histories and annals are already fully operational as well in these early 3 works. So that gets you only that far, because what you can then do is you can say like, okay, I'm just going to trace some of these themes and like see how they interact with each other. And it's like, okay, that's what I did in the dissertation version, which like most classicists, I reread about a year and a half later, and I was like, that's cute, but that cannot be it. It cannot be the end all be all, right? Like be all end all. And so what I did in the book was I went sequentially, starting with the Agricola, and then I looked at how the Germania and the Agricola interact with one another. And then I went to the Dialogus, and I traced how the Dialogus interacts with the other 2 works. And then that way I went through the entire corpus. And what essentially I argue is that far from being these inferior preliminary attempts to get ready for his true sort of vocation of historical writing, is that he actually uses each earlier work as a very important source in its own right. So that rather than relegating these things to sort of like minor works that don't really matter, he actually goes back and sort of intertextually like engages with these earlier works with an extraordinary frequency, where they're almost as good as, referring to Cicero and Livy and, all these. Yeah. So it's basically like in that respect, kind of like a radical sort of like new look at how to read him. And then out of that come observations, of course, about, larger topics, like what does he think about X emperor, Y emperor, about the Principate as a system, and so forth. But that was the original sort of like motivation, to say no one has taken the corpus as a whole and read it as an integrated project. People have sort of said like, Agricola, cool, important. Germania, cool, important. But how does it actually fit together? And I argue that it's basically an integrated project from start to finish.
So I take it to mean that the dating on these works is secure enough that you are confident that this is the sequence, or
yes.
Okay, all right.
Yes, yeah.
So
there's definitely
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say your thesis has a lot of psychological plausibility for this reason, and that is people do go through political shifts in their lives. I think this is a pretty well-established pattern, but I think it's usually much earlier than 40 years old. I think of, my thinking as a 20-year-old, my thinking as a 40-year-old. I went through some changes, but 40 is pretty old to be undergoing such a radical change, or even a strengthening in one direction. That's pretty uncommon. So that lends plausibility to your thesis from my perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I like that.
And Jeff,
yes.
Speaking of plausibility to theses,
yes,
it's time for the ads. This episode of Ad Nauseam is brought to you by the good folks at Hackett Publishing. Hackett Publishing, with offices in Cambridge, Massachusetts and Indianapolis, Indiana, have been bringing fine classics and other sorts of literary works to the reading public for how many years, Jeff?
54.
54.
Easy for me to remember because that's they've been around as long as I have.
I guess they decided to mark your birth
Yeah.
with the inauguration of a publishing house, a classics publishing house.
Some serendipity there. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So, Jeff, what do you like about Hackett?
I love Hackett because it's affordable. They put out an attractive product, always clever with the artwork, and it's just high quality scholarship. And that's a really difficult thing to find. All three of those things in one package.
Yes, you can get excellent scholarship from some of these European publishers whom we shall not name.
Nope.
Right? You can get excellent scholarship, attractive books sometimes, but
who can afford them?
You're going to have to sell a kidney
Exactly.
in order to be able to get one of those.
That's right.
But Hackett hits the sweet spot. So, listener, if you would like to do two important things. First of all, you'd like to build your own library of classics and other kinds of literature. And secondly, if you'd like to support our podcast, then here's what we'd like you to do.
You need to go to hackettpublishing.com, HACKETT publishing.com. Check out their amazing catalog. Yes, there is a flood of classics there, but there's also all kinds of other things to find.
Modern philosophy.
Asian studies.
That's right. South American studies.
Religious studies.
Islamic studies.
Yep. Click around, find the books that you want, and you can put in the coupon code that we offer you, which is AN2025. So it's AN in the current year. And Dave, that will get them two fabulous things.
Yes, it will get them 20% off their entire order and delivery by Pack Animal or St. Bernard.
Really?
Yes, a St. Bernard will run up to your door and then open up that tiny little barrel around his neck.
With its paws?
With its paws.
That's amazing.
Have you watched No Cartoons?
I know what you're talking about.
Okay. And then, along with a cocktail, will come out book. No, that's not it.
No. It's free shipping.
Free shipping.
Free shipping, right. And you cannot get that at other river-based
you can't.
purveyors of text.
Check it out.
This episode of Ad Nauseam is also brought to you by Ratio Coffee. Dave, I am looking at that internet thing. It's in front of me right now. And it's actually, you sent this to me. This is from a website called Serious Eats, where they are ranking.
Hold on there.
Yes.
What is the name of the website?
Serious Eats.
Serious Eats. How come I have never heard of this before? I am a serious eater.
I know. I know
you?
this about you, right? I've never heard of this either.
Huh.
But
so what does Serious Eats have to do with the ratio?
Well, they have a page where they are ranking the best automatic drip coffee makers that are out there. And guess what comes in at number one?
Dak and Blecker?
No.
Gurek with its marsupials?
No.
Senior Coffee?
Not even close.
The Brackish Tangsters?
No, I almost wish they made the list.
Yeah.
They list at number one the Ratio 6.
Oh, really? Tell us more.
They write, this is the best coffee maker you can buy, arguably also the best looking. It functions like a pour-over setup with an automatic bloom phase and a wide, smartly designed shower head. Its brew bed saturation was outstanding. Boy, there's nothing like a good brew bed saturation. Was outstanding with no tunneling or dry spots.
Oh, interesting. We could make something of that. Tunneling and dry spots?
I hate it when my previous coffee makers tunneled.
I do
leaving
too.
Holes all over the house.
That's correct. How many coffee makers have you owned in your life, Jeff? Can you estimate?
Oh, boy. Probably about a dozen.
I was going to say 12 to 15.
Yes, exactly.
I went through one of those Gavalia calf phases where you buy the coffee, they give you the machine.
Right.
Remember that?
Oh, yes, that's right.
It was like a big deal. I'm thinking, this is such a great deal.
Yeah.
I'll say the coffee was okay.
Yeah.
I have owned the same coffee machine, the 8, now for 6 years, and I can't imagine ever buying another one.
No way.
Because this is a permanently high-functioning machine.
It does, right. So, as this ad says, no tunneling or dry spots.
Right.
And it makes delicious coffee, big and small batches, and dark and light roasts alike.
Did you have some this morning?
I did, of course.
Was this at the home station or was it in the office?
I both, actually.
So what do you have at the home station?
I got the home station. I got the 8.
Wow.
And I have that kind of queued up and ready to go. I just come down the stairs and hit that button.
Wow.
And then I have the 4 in my office.
Right.
And so it's perfect.
Wow. So are you sharing the 4 with anyone at the office?
No, it's all for me, right? My colleagues are mostly they're those tea drinkers.
Are they tea drinkers? Okay, that's all right. Well, listener, if you're a coffee drinker and you're thinking, I'm ready to take my coffee game to the next level, yes, the ratio is not cheap, but maybe you really enjoy the coffee life and you don't want cheap coffee. Go to ratiocoffee.com/Ad ad nauseum.
Yes.
Pick out the machine of your choice, the 8, the 6, the 4. Then, Jeff, they have a coupon code to enter.
Yes, that coupon code is ANRatio, ANRATIO 2025.
And that will get them $20 off their choice of machine. Check it out.
So, Bram, as we get back into this, I'm curious of in your process of turning the dissertation into the book. And we've talked a little bit about some of the changes that you made, but what were kind of some particular kind of obstacles and roadblocks, kind of issues that you ran into as you were kind of developing this larger thesis?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so, yeah, when I, this is mostly one of structure, not so much mainly of approach, but of structure. So what I did in the dissertation was I took each of those quote unquote minor works, each of those 3 works, and placed them immediately alongside the histories and the annals. So I had a chapter on the Agricola and the histories and annals, and then a separate chapter on the Germania and the histories and annals, and then a separate chapter on the Dialogus and the histories and annals. And that worked well enough at that stage, and I thought it was a pretty decent piece of work. But then as I started reflecting, I'm like, look, I'm never talking about the interactions amongst those early 3 works. And I'm also not really sort of getting to a longer sort of like, developmental line. And so that is where the idea arose. It's like, no, I need to take a sequential approach, not only because an ancient reader would have in fact gotten their hands on it in that order, right? So like the idea would have been, and it's clear that Tacitus means for us to do this anyway, that by the time you get to say the histories, that you have some familiarity with the earlier 3 works. And so by setting it up the way that I had in the dissertation, that basically didn't come out, and that became obvious. And so that meant that instead of doing it that way, I had to basically engage in a full sort of like intertextual analysis of each of those interactions, each subsequent work with the prior works, and that took a lot more time. And that's how I came to kind of sort of substantially revise it, which is fine, and that often happens anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Could you give us a specific example or two of where you see Tacitus kind of using an earlier work, or where you kind of see this thread specifically?
Yeah, so one obvious one is in the prefaces to the different works, where he engages sort of like with similar strategies and how he positions himself vis-a-vis the imperial government, and how he positions himself as an author, where he basically picks up strands from each of those earlier prefaces and then builds on that. One of the more well-known versions of this continuity is where he places political sentiments, both about the empire and about imperial Rome, in the mouths of these foreign chiefs, right? That's one of those standard things where you want to pass criticism, on your government, but you say, well, I didn't say it. This Scottish chief said it, and it's like, really? Right?
It was the Canadian prime minister.
Yeah, that's right. I didn't say it. Right. So he does this really well, and that there's a whole tradition on this, but where you really see where he starts to use language from his earlier texts. So in the Agricola, the 2 famous examples, right, are the Boudiccan revolt, right, against the Icenian queen Boudica, and Tacitus gives her a speech, and then he gives a speech to Calgacus, who is the Scottish chief, this Caledonian chief, and these are basically sentiments that are critical of the empire as a, let's say, an enterprise. And then you get to the histories, and you go to the Batavian revolt, right, initiated by one of my, ancestors, right, Kiwilis. Yeah, I'm right from around that area too, so that's funny.
Wow.
Right, and he gets a bunch of speeches, and then it's like, okay, wait a minute, you can clearly see that he picks language that he's already used in these earlier speeches, so thereby you are meant to put these next to each other and say, okay, what has changed? What has stayed the same? Why is he ascribing X argument to this figure, but Y argument to that figure? What's the significance of that? And then you get to the annals, and you got speeches of Arminius, his brother, Segestus, and you got Thracian chiefs in there, African chiefs, and they all pick up that strand, so that by the time you get to the end, you've got this whole developed set of speeches. That's one of the more famous sort of like exercises in this. But it gets particularly fun when he uses language that's rare, right? Where he comes up with this like really weird adjective that, occurs 3 times in all of Latin literature, except it occurs in the Agricola, the Germania, and the histories. And then you're like, okay, you are sure that he's going back, to this earlier point, and he wants us to recognize it as such. That's kind of the exercise. And then you can start to like really see that the earlier texts function as background really for the reader, as interpretive sort of like help and guidance for the later text. And then you do get to some interesting like sort of like different readings and understandings. So, like no one, I think, as far as I know, and I may be wrong because we can't read it all, right? But, no one had really tried to read the Germania. There's like weird ethnography about these northern tribes with the dialogus. Like to read those two things in conjunction seems absurd. Right? What does an ethnography about Germania have to do with a dialogue on oratory? But then I started looking more closely, and you can actually get an entire sort of network of textual links where I think, and I argue this, and gosh, who knows whether I'm right, but where he's basically likening Republican orators who were still vigorous in their art and got the right amount of practice and operated in the right environment and so forth, with like battle-tested and battle-ready Germanic warriors. And he compares imperial orators to Romans who live under emperors and who thereby are becoming more and more lethargic and are no longer battle-ready. And I'm like, well, that is actually kind of interesting because again, he can't say that out loud, but he can make you as the reader tease that out. And I think that he's a master at that. So that would be kind of like, it's super
That's
cool.
fascinating. So many more questions to ask, but I want to make sure I sneak this one in before time runs out on us, and that is grad school experience. One of my best professors, Jack Holtzmark, that we've talked about on the program before. He was teaching Cicero, and he said one summer I read all of the Philippics, the second Philippic in particular, and Cicero's a genius in some ways, but he said it just gets too repetitive to cleanse my palate in terms of Latin style. I have to read some Tacitus because that's really interesting. So I would just like you to interact with that general notion of when you pick up Tacitus now, is it easy for you? Is it delightful? Have you become an anti-Ciceronian because the Tacitian style is sharp and so different?
Yeah, no, definitely not easy ever. Because he is one of those authors that every time you reread him, you're like, I hadn't quite seen it that way. That's obviously why classicists have jobs, right? Because we reread the same text in different ways. So that's kind of like, no, I can totally understand that sentiment because his style is in many ways, it's somewhat Thucydidean and Celestian in the sense that, he purposefully, does quote unquote the wrong thing grammatically on purpose, right? He has these constructions that just make very little sense based on the quote unquote rules, right? Which he does for rhetorical effect. So if you are coming off of a summer of reading Cicero, which is so clean, right? With these lengthy periodic sentences and it's so nice. And then you get to Tacitus, it's a completely different feel, right? Where it's short, you have these sound bites, right? He holds off certain words and puts them into positions where they ought not to be. And it's a completely different experience. And it's never easy to translate him because he's very ambiguous and he will use metaphor very powerfully and he will use particular sort of expressions in a sense or in a way where as a reader, you're really left with multiple options as to how to take that. And that is something that, basically as a historian, you're like, come on, give us some clarity. We would like to know what you really mean.
Right.
For the purist, that's the fun, right? Because that leaves it open, to interpretation. So for me, it never gets old. But I do get, like, if you've read a lot of Cicero, Tacitus could be refreshing. But equally, I think if you've read a lot of Tacitus for months in a row, I think reading some Cicero might also be very healthy.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Do you have any quick words of advice, either for the student who's reading Tacitus in translation, or for the ambitious Latin student who thinks I'm going to approach Tacitus for the first time? What's the top 3 words of advice you might give as how it should be approached?
So there actually are good student textbooks on Tacitus now. I reviewed one, I think in 2014. Those Bogazzi-like readers,
Sure.
Bogazzi, Carducci readers. Yep. So Stephen Rutledge did one on Tacitus. He's a very renowned, very, very, very well-respected scholar in Tacitus circles. He did one, and I used that for one of the courses I did on Tacitus way back in the day when I first got here at Hope. And the students managed that very, very well. So in one way, it's, pick the right texts. Some are harder than others. And I think the other piece of advice would be patient, right? Be patient, understand that when Tacitus scares you, and I'm talking to students mostly right now, that is the expected outcome. If Tacitus kind of scares you and you feel like half the time, I'm not sure if I'm reading this right, you're probably doing the right thing. And that can be kind of discouraging sometimes, right? Where you're like, I should be translating as an art where you should at least have some idea of what is actually meant here.
Right.
With him, that is sometimes the purpose. And so that's not even just down to you, like, okay, my Latin isn't good enough. That is actually like, he is making you think and stumble, because that's actually what he does. So yeah, I think that's the best piece of advice. And, maybe read some Sallust ahead of time.
Right.
That might help too.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Bram, we're kind of getting into
getting close
to kind of the end of things. And so, one thing I read in your biography, which I thought was interesting, this is outside of the book, but that you do a course on that involves talking about how Tacitus has been misused. I think you talk about like the Germania as being used by the Nazis as a way of justifying their ideology. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. This is by far sort of the favorite thing I've taught. This is a class that I originally in 2019 co-taught with a colleague and good friend in German. And the way that this is set up, we use a book by Chris Crapes out of Stanford. I'm not sure if that's a name that's familiar to you guys. So he's a very, very well respected Latinist out of Stanford, and he wrote a book called A Most Dangerous Book. Right, Tacitus's Germania from I don't recall exactly until the Third Reich. Right, very, very, very good, but very accessible book for students, even just at the undergraduate level. And it traces the reception of the Germania after its sole manuscript was rediscovered in the mid-1500s, in a very chaotic time in Northern Europe, and then how it was used and misused, sort of like throughout the centuries for ideological purposes. And it's one of those texts that had a really outsized influence on the history of ideas in Europe, yet no one's heard of it. No one's heard of it, because fair, right? Even if you get to teach a course on Tacitus, what do people choose? The Annals, a book of the Annals, maybe the Agricola. No one's going to pick up the Germania, but in terms of European history, that text was way more influential. And so what we do there, what is really cool, is that by the time you get to, the National Socialists in Germany, you see that they are actually simply picking up a discourse that is centuries old. And that what they actually try to put into practice, so sort of like this sort of racial purification of last century Germany, is an idea that had been, at least at that point, in its fully fledged form, almost 50, 60 years in the making. And that what distinguishes the Nazis from the ideologues who were playing with the ideas in the previous generation is that they actually simply tried to make it happen. Right. So what is interesting for the students is that we tend to set, the Nazis sort of apart as this exceptionally like dark episode, in Western history. And that is of course comfortable, because then we don't have to admit that this may happen again and we have nothing to do with this, whatever.
Right.
But when you actually put that into this longer sort of like genesis of ideas, this longer development, you see that they were basically the logical culmination of a process that lasts centuries. And that changes that picture quite substantially. And so what we do is we start them off with an overview of Roman history, and then we pick up that we have them read the Germania, or I have them read the Germania in English for a whole week, just very attentively. And then we read through that book. So then they're really well situated to see how the text literally at some point just, blatantly gets rewritten to fit particular ideological purposes. And then, once we get into that and we finish it, we just finished with it last week, we do a bunch of case studies, where we see similar dynamics where, current sort of like regimes, are trying to go back to a sort of like better time in the past as a way of moving forward. So we do a case study on Ukraine and Putin and what he's trying to do there, and how he might be trying to recoup some of that Kievan Rus sort of like history. We have a segment on Erdogan and how Erdogan, who has been distinctly sort of anti-Western, especially as contrasted with what Ataturk was doing.
Prime Minister.
Right? Yeah, and like, like and look at that in terms of new Ottomanism, right? Where he's trying to sort of profile himself as an Ottoman, chief almost, or Ottoman Sultan. We do a section on Saddam Hussein and how he played with Mesopotamian and Assyrian kingship models. And so just to show the students, ancient texts, do get manipulated this way. And this is part of a larger sort of ideological game that a lot of different governments in the world are playing. And, you as a college student need to be introduced to this kind of stuff before you walk out of here. And it's been such a fun class. Yeah, I love teaching it.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm going to read that Crepes book now. I'm going to look
It
at
is
some
super
readers,
accessible. Yeah, it's like $10, $12. It's super accessible.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah, he would be happy to know that you picked it up.
Oh yeah. Maybe we can get him on the show sometime. We can leverage our budding friendship with you to try to
Sure, use me. Yes,
him in.
absolutely.
I would also like to leverage our new friendship with Bram to interview his wife.
Oh yes, the archaeologist.
She should get on talk some Roman archaeology.
Oh, absolutely.
She's probably much more interesting than he is. Jeff.
I would think so too. I'll be the first to admit that. Yes, absolutely.
Did I say that out loud?
Yeah.
So as we wind down here, we want to ask some lighter questions. Do you keep up your tennis? Have they brought you in to coach the Hope tennis team or anything like that?
They have not. I don't play as much anymore because of that shoulder issue that I've had, and it's been a little busy. Over the since I got here, and that is a good problem to have because classics is well and alive at Hope, and
that's wonderful.
I often teaching 8 classes a year easily because we have demand, which is really really good. I was on sabbatical last semester and tried pickleball. For the first time. Now, I actually really enjoyed that. And a really good thing for me is that there's no way for me to hurt myself because compared to tennis, that's so light that I could just kind of go like full sort of like full throttle, full speed. And I didn't feel a thing on my shoulder. So I think that's more of where I'm leaning. But yeah, I've engaged with the coaches and played with them a little bit, but I haven't been involved in coaching. There's simply no time.
Well, we could recycle some bad puns here, Jeff, about how Bram could win in the Kentucky Dilby, right?
Yeah, I think we should spare.
All right. And then the final question from me, at least, and then I'll hand it over to Jeff, who's more sane. We usually ask professional classicists like yourself, Bram, what kind of advice would you like to give to our audience? We have Latin teachers, we have Latin students, we have people who are not studying the languages but are just interested in the general material. What would you like to say to them in terms of, encouragement or advice?
Engage as much as you can. So for Latin students, read as much as you can. Continue in college. We kind of have this model at Hope where we no longer push classics as like the sole major that a student would do just because the career prospects, especially on the professorial side, are so dismal that it is, but that does not mean that it's not a wonderful thing to pursue alongside something else. So like every single one of our classics majors is a double or triple major. And so that is one piece of advice: never stop, right? It doesn't have to be the single thing that you focus on, and put all your eggs in that basket. But I would say that it is one of the most important and also fruitful things to study alongside what would then maybe become your primary focus in college. So never stop. For teachers, that's difficult. I mean, there's so many good Latin teachers out there that I would like to ask them for advice, to bring their strategies into my classrooms. But I would say there too, teach students as widely as possible. Right? Teach the Germania, maybe do something similar, get that text in there as well with its complicated sort of after history, because students need to be aware of how the classics are still relevant, right? Some of this stuff is still happening, as we speak. In terms of the regular student that may be drawn to the podcast, I would say, you do Latin or Greek as your language requirement, but do not simply pursue it as only your language requirement. No one cares if you do 2 semesters of a language because everyone else does 2 semesters of a language. It's pointless. No one cares. But by going to that 3rd or 4th semester, not only will you actually get the fruits of your labor and actually read some Cicero or some Virgil or whatever the case may be, but it's actually still, even though we live in an age where humanities are obviously suffering widely, I have still seen employers have a great deal of respect for people who have devoted, a lot of time and energy, to the classics and to some of the great, works of literature. So that's the main message. Like, keep engaging, engage a lot, engage widely, and can keep studying, even alongside other interests.
Fantastic. I think that's a great
place.
note to end on. And
Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And those who are interested in Bram's book, it's widely available on Amazon and other places. Writing Imperial History, Tacitus from Agricola to Annales, Bram L.H. ten Berge, and we highly recommend it.
Thank you, Bram.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
And you're
All
welcome.
right. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
All right, Dave. Hey, we got to get out of
Yes.
here. It was a great interview.
Yes.
Love talking to Bram.
What a wonderful guest we had in Mr. Bram.
We'll have to get him back on when he finishes his next book, or or just to hang out.
That's right. And I'm very proud of us, Jeff, I must say.
Yes.
Because we didn't make any stupid jokes about his name.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a perfectly fine Dutch name, but let's be honest, it's a little bit unusual in our experience.
It's true. Yes, exactly. Were you thinking?
No.
I was thinking like Bram.
No.
What? No, you're not going to go there?
I'm not going to make any jokes on his name.
Exactly. Well, I was just going to say it reminds me, the only Bram I've ever encountered is Bram Bones from The Legend of Sleepy Hollow.
I was thinking of Bram Stoker, who,
Bram, of course,
who wrote the Dracula books.
Right, exactly.
But we didn't do any of that.
You are itching to drop.
No, I'm
some-
not.
What?
So why do we have to get out of here?
Well, you hear that racket?
I hear that.
outside?
Oh, the racket,
Yeah,
the banging and
the banging and the
clanging?
racket. Yeah, exactly. You know who's out there?
I do not.
It's Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer.
What about Djokovic?
I think he's in the car, but they want a rematch
with
Bram. Exactly right.
I don't think they know what they're asking for.
No, especially since he's not actually here in this room.
That's
I don't know why they're
correct.
coming down here.
He's going to unleash some Tacitean fury on their tennis game.
Exactly. So Rafael Nadal's bringing kind of some of that.
Andrew Murray.
Yeah, some of that European Spanish fury.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's.
Are you a tennis watcher?
I enjoy tennis.
I do too.
I never played it. I was never good at it.
It's very hard on the neck.
The back and forth.
Not the playing of the game, but
just
the
the watching.
Exactly. To the left, to the right, to the left. When is this volley going to be over?
So I just tend to focus on one side of the court.
That's fair.
Just to save myself. But
so we do have to get out of here.
We do, though. Yeah.
But Jeff, before we do, what do we need to do in terms of some housekeeping?
You need to tell us about how our audience could learn some Greek or Latin.
Yes. Okay. So if you go to latinperdiem.com, you can find out what makes my programs unique. This is my claim. Test it. Do a little bit of investigation, some inquiry. I was checking the other day, hundreds of Latin and Greek students over the last few years, and a lot of satisfied customers.
Fantastic.
From the very young to the the more senescent, I'd like to say.
It's never too late to start.
It is never too late.
Yeah.
So you want to start out with Latin, you want to go ab initio, check out our LLPSI programs using Hans Orberg's Familia Romana. It's a great value. You want to do some Greek, we got the Moss method, which features your favorite aspect on Friday.
I love the office hours.
That's correct.
Yep.
We got together this past Friday, read some more Xenophon, had a new individual join us from somewhere in upstate New York, and paid me a really nice compliment, and in the interest of self-promotion, I'll share it.
Excellent. What did he say?
He said something along the lines of, I've never been a part of a one-room schoolhouse, and I really like it. So we put together people from different backgrounds, and we're all reading Greek together in a way that is fine-tuned to their level.
Fantastic. And they can find, interested parties can find this all at latinperdiem.com.
That's correct.
Yep.
Or go to the YouTube channel, more than 2,100 free 4-minute videos. Maybe you say, Noe, I want to study Greek and Latin, but I'm not paying you.
Yeah.
Go to YouTube and watch it for free. I would be very happy with that.
There you go.
So, Jeff, let's say they want to get a shout out or something like that. They want to complain or compliment. What should they do?
They can write to you, Dave at adnauseum.com. Don't forget that V. Or
you can write to Jeff at adnauseum.com. Don't forget the V in ad nauseum. And maybe they want to sign up to win a Ratio 4?
Yes. So write to Dave at adnauseum.com, and send in this code word, quatuor.
What is that?
Quatuor is the Latin word for the number 4. Quattuor.
And that will get them the opportunity to win a Ratio 4 when we have the drawing on
the 26th of this month.
That's correct.
So that's coming up next
week. It's about a week away.
Yep.
So now's the time to get your entry in.
Yes.
We got some people to thank. We need to thank our wonderful sound engineer, Miss Mishka, who turns this around in record time. This one's going to be a little bit challenging.
Exactly. So every time we do an interview, it's a little bit more heavy lifting.
That's right.
But she always does such a nice job.
Yep.
And how about those musicians?
Right.
Scott Van Zen, Ken Tamplin, just killing it on the guitar.
Right.
It kind of gives us a little bit more edge.
That's right.
Yes.
We like to be a little bit edgy. If the caffeine isn't enough, try
right.
some arpeggiated rock and or roll.
Indeed. Hey, check out our website, adnauseum.com. Don't forget that V. And check out our Lurch with merch section. Pick yourself up a shirt, a Kwai Dokent shirt.
Yeah, a hat,
a sticker to show the world that you are
taking in the classics and keeping them down.
Excellent. Dave, I believe you have a very germane.
Oh, nice.
That's a gustatory parting shot.
That's a top-level pun there, Winkle. But before we get to it, we should announce what we're doing next week.
Yes, we're going back to Maru.
Mahru,
right?
That's
chapter.
right.
Yep.
Which has to do with everyone's favorite subject, science.
Science, you say?
Ancient science. All right. So here's the gustatory parting shot. It is from Tacitus's Germania, chapter 23, as translated by Alfred John Church. Quote, "A liquor for drinking is made out of barley or other grain and fermented into a certain resemblance to wine." Jeff, what do you think Tacitus is talking about?
He's talking about beer.
Beer, okay. Yeah. The dwellers on the riverbank also buy wine. Their food is of a simple kind, consisting of wild fruit, fresh game, and curdled milk.
Gross.
So I think, this is strawberries, yogurt, and gator jerky, I think is what they're doing.
This is just like a jug of milk that's been left out for a week?
No, I don't think so.
All right.
They satisfy their hunger without elaborate preparation and without delicacy. So they just go to the refrigerator, just rip it open, and just shovel it down like a duck would eat without chewing. And then says Tacitus, in quenching their thirst, they are not equally moderate.
Oh, no.
Here comes some German stereotypes. If you indulge their love of drinking by supplying them with as much as they desire, they will be overcome by their own vices as easily as by the arms of an enemy.
Wow, exactly. It reminds me of that time I went to Oktoberfest.
Really? We don't need to hear about that. Thanks for listening.
Thanks.